A glass shattered on the marble floor, and every head in the bank lobby turned. Ethan froze, his hand still trembling above the ledger he had just altered. The security guard's radio crackled with a message no one else could hear. Grace's phone lit up with a single name, Daniel, though she swore she had blocked him. A child's cough echoed faintly from the manager's office, too fragile for this place. And in that suspended silence, everyone seemed to realize something was about to break. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you. I don't want to miss it. Rain moved over the glass like slow fingers, blurring streetlights into thin, golden threads. The bank's neon sign buzzed a tired welcome, and inside the lobby the lights hummed steady as a heartbeat. It was a morning that held a small, damp patience, the kind of morning that waited for people to choose whether to look away or to face what was coming. Ethan Carter stood by the teller windows and watched a woman count coins into a clear plastic bag. He watched because it gave him time to think without admitting he was thinking. At 42, with salt at his temples and the crease of sleep still under his eyes, Ethan had learned the craft of small kindnesses. How to smile with precision, how to hide the tremor when numbers did not add up to a life he imagined. He had learned how to keep the bank's clean facade even when the ground underneath felt soft. The bank had a smell today, paper towels, cheap coffee, the faint metal tang of coins. Outside, the rain turned the city into a watercolor. Inside, the tick of the wall clock mapped out the minutes that made up his life. He reached for a paper cup and poured coffee that tasted of burnt hope. When he turned, his hand brushed something slid under his office door, a small, stiff envelope with no stamp, no name, just a single line written across the front in blue ink. "I'll pay you double if you have a balance." Ethan stood still. The envelope could have been a joke, a mistake, anything. He felt the whisper of a memory. His mother teaching him how to fold money into neat rows, how to pretend that scarcity did not exist. He put the cup down and sat, the cheap chair creaking under him. He thought of the balance sheet on his desk, the numbers that had felt heavier this month, heavier than they should. The mortgage letter is waiting unopened at home. The medicine bottle on the kitchen counter with a name he always said quietly, as if it might hear. He tore the envelope open like a man opening a wound. Inside was a single slip of paper. No signature, no return address, just the same line written again, and beneath it a time. Thursday, noon. A place, the Blue Lantern 2 blocks east. The handwriting was careful, unemotional, the kind someone used when they wanted nothing traced back to them. Ethan read it twice, then a third time, as if more reading would change the meaning. He put the paper in his palm and felt its thinness like a pulse. It could be a scam. It could be a test. It could be troublesome. He had always been good at reading trouble. He had spent years reading the faces of customers too proud to say they were short. He had watched the way people folded when bad luck came. He thought about calling the police, but the idea felt like giving up a private war. He thought about throwing the paper away, about pretending it had never existed, but his thumb found the crease and smoothed it. He looked through his office window at the lobby. Tellers moving in slow choreography, a clock that did not care about his choices. The city was easy to ignore if you chose to. Ethan did not choose to ignore things well. A soft knock at the door made him fold the paper and tuck it into his breast pocket. "Come in," he said, and the door opened to reveal Grace, his assistant. Grace had a way of moving that suggested she had not forgiven the world for being careless with people. She carried 2 deposit slips and a look that asked if he had slept. Her hair was a practical bob. Her voice was steady. She had been with Ethan for 5 years, through small storms and half-forgotten successes. Christian name, Steady Hands. When she smiled, the bank seemed less heavy. "Morning, Ethan," she said. "We've got a line at window 3. The Johnsons are waiting to sign for the safety deposit box. Also, the branch audit report came through last night." She hesitated, then added, "You look like you didn't sleep." "Late night," Ethan said. He kept his voice flat, like covering a fragile thing with a blanket. "Is everything okay with the audit?" "Same as always," Grace said. "A few minor flags." Nothing that will bite us. But she glanced toward his chest where the paper lay hidden and asked softly, "Are you all right?" He almost lied. He almost said everything was fine. Instead, he told her about the envelope, and as he spoke, the paper felt heavier, a small, obscene weight against his heart. Grace listened in a way that made him feel no smaller, not pitying, not shocked. She was simply there, storing the fact for later. "Sounds like someone trying to stir trouble," she said finally. "Maybe a joke. Maybe someone looking to get money out of you. Don't go alone, though." Ethan nodded. He thought of the Blue Lantern, a dim bar with amber lights and cheap whiskey. He thought of Thursday noon, a time when most honest people had work and would not be thinking of traps. The note had the smell of a challenge. It smelled worse when he considered why anyone would bother to test a man who sat behind a desk that managed other people's money. He told Grace he would think about it. He did not tell her the real part, how close his own balance had come to zero last month, how he had shifted money from accounts he managed to cover a family crisis without anyone knowing, how small acts of borrowing had meandered into a pattern. He did not tell her that he had, for months, been walking a line between duty and survival. People in the lobby traded stories of minor tragedies: lost checks, a child's first savings, a late fee that felt like a personal failure. Ethan moved among them with practiced ease, a ship's captain steering through a harbor of small catastrophes. He smiled when he should smile, offered reassurances he could not always feel. He filed forms, signed authorization stamps, approved loans with a hand that sometimes trembled when the numbers looked like cliffs. By midday, his office smelled of old paper and coffee and the faint metallic tang of worry. He thought about the future like a ledger, columns, predictable entries. But life had a way of introducing a single crooked line across all the rows. That envelope had drawn such a line. Outside, the city wore rain like a shawl. People moved under umbrellas that bristled like black flowers. The Blue Lantern sat 2 blocks away, its sign a flicker of blue through the wet. Ethan imagined the place full of familiar faces, men with calloused hands, a jukebox that hadn't been touched in years. He imagined the note's author, calm, measured, someone who took risks for reasons he could not yet know. He imagined a man who knew what he needed to break someone. At his desk, he opened the drawer where he kept things he did not want to lose: a photograph of his father with a stubborn grin, a small brass coin his son had given him years ago when the boy was still learning to find his reflection in his father's eyes. He thought of his son, Matthew, who called sometimes and spoke of university, and the future, as if the future were a room they could both enter together. His throat tightened. He had promised Matthew things he could not always keep. Ethan folded his hands and let the noise of the bank press at the edges of his concentration. The ledger on his desk demanded attention. There were accounts to balance, customers to reassure, a branch to keep afloat. But there, under the business of numbers, lay the thin paper in his pocket. A promise or a threat, both the same in its finality. He could ignore it. He could answer it. Any choice would push him and those around him into motion. He stood and walked to the window, pressing his forehead briefly to the cool glass. The rain smeared the city into something softer, less precise. He could have been anyone in that blur. A man who kept accounts, a man who owed favors, a man who had once believed that honesty alone was a shield. He closed his eyes and let himself imagine the ledger without the telltale red. He let himself imagine a life in which the numbers balanced and the coffee tasted like success. When the clock on the wall clicked 11, Ethan folded the note and slid it into his pocket again. He did not know who had sent it. He did not know whether it was an invitation or a warning. He only knew that the balance was fragile and that someone, somewhere, had noticed. The Blue Lantern smelled of fried oil and old beer, and when Ethan pushed the door, the warmth hit him like a hand on the back. The rain had thinned to a mist that made the neon sign wobble, and inside the bar a radio murmured a slow song that belonged to another decade. Noon had a hollow feel here. Workers on break, an old man nursing a cup, the barmaid wiping the counter as if polishing time itself. Ethan sat at a corner table, the paper folded like a promise in his palm. He watched people without looking like he watched them. The habit of a man who spent his life watching balances tilt. He had planned to sit where he could see the door. He had not planned for how his hands would sweat when a stranger crossed the room and offered his hand with a smile that did not reach his eyes. The man was younger than Ethan expected, late 30s, maybe early 40s, with a neat beard and a suit that fit like it belonged to someone used to being obeyed. He carried no watch. He sat opposite Ethan without asking, as if he had always been meant to sit there. Up close, Ethan noticed the cleanness of the man's clothes, the faint fragrance of cedar and expensive soap. He noticed, without meaning to, the way the man watched Ethan's face more than his hands. "I don't know why you came," the man said, voice low and even, "but you did. That tells me something." Ethan's throat tightened. He put the folded paper on the table between them like a dividing line. "You wrote this?" he asked. The man looked at the paper as if it were an object that belonged to someone else. "I did," he said, "and I'll repeat it. I'll pay you double if you have a balance." Ethan almost laughed to keep from crying. Double. The idea landed in him like a coin that might buy the rest of his life. For a moment, the bar narrowed, the radio muted, and the only sound was the distant tick of a clock someone else owned. "Why?" Ethan asked, because asking felt safer than answering. The stranger's smile thinned. "Because balances tell a story," he said. "Because I want to know who keeps their books clean and who borrows shadows. Because sometimes a small favor can prove loyalty. Because," he watched Ethan then measuring, "because I pay well for certain kinds of truth." Ethan thought of the ledger in his office, the tiny shifts he had made when the mortgage bill came due. He thought of Matthew, his boy who called from university with plans that sounded like light. He thought of the coin his son had given him long ago. The idea that someone would pay to test him felt like a key or a trap. He folded his hands around the paper, as if holding a flame. "Who are you?" he asked, the question heavier than curiosity. The man hesitated, as if savoring the moment. "Call me Daniel." He gave a name that was plain and safe. Daniel. Ethan had met Daniels before, managers, accountants, men who wore neat suits and carried authority lightly. "I have interests in the bank," Daniel said. "I like to know who will stand when the tide comes in." Ethan's mouth formed a small, bitter laugh. "You can figure that out without paying me." "I prefer certainty," Daniel said. "And I prefer methods that give me more than paper proof." He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. Inside was a stack of bills, thick enough to be insulting. "You know the amount I mean. Double." Ethan looked at the money as if it were the final chapter of a book he had never finished reading. Pride and need tangled inside him. He thought of handing the money back. He thought of leaving the envelope on the table and walking away. But the line between what he could refuse and what he could not had grown thin. Before he could answer, a voice rose behind him, sharp, familiar, a bark half buried in amusement. "If this is some kind of joke, Daniel, you're losing your touch." Ethan turned. The man who stood at the doorway wore an expression like someone holding a silver spoon too close to the sun. He had a broad face, a laugh that often broke rooms in two, and the easy confidence of someone who had spent his life giving orders and expecting them followed. He was Paul Henderson, branch manager. Paul's tie was loose, his suit a little rumpled in a way that suggested he had just left a meeting and decided the rest of the day would be his. Paul grinned down at the two men. He had the habit of laughing at the edges, at the places where the world tried to be serious. "I'll pay you double if you have a balance," he said aloud, mocking the line, and then he laughed, a clear, high laugh that made Daniel's eyes narrow for a breath. He took a step into the bar and clapped Daniel on the shoulder. "You trying to buy our teller's secrets now? You city types are a riot." Daniel's smile did not change, but something in his posture shifted, a line drawn like a crack in glass. He stood and inclined his head politely. "Paul, a pleasure." Paul's laughter filled the blue lantern in the way large men fill small spaces. He turned to Ethan with that careless warmth that had made customers trust him and made staff feel a little less lonely. "Ethan, are you choosing the wrong chairs these days? You look like you've been fed bad coffee." Ethan forced his jaw to unclench. He had worked under Paul for years. Paul had the manager's easy way of believing the world owed him nothing and forgiving the world for it. Paul did not know Daniel. Paul did not see the neatness in the man's eyes. Paul only saw the joke and the money and the chance to be amused. Just a meeting, Ethan said. No harm. Paul still laughed, and this time the laugh told a story of small towns, of men who thought they knew the whole shape of things. Double? Huh. Daniel, if you're buying, I'll take one of those envelopes. We've got enough squirrels in this town to hide most of your investments. The way Paul said, this town, made Daniel look not amused, but instead thinly patient. He slid into a chair as if he had been put out of rhythm. I did not come to be mocked, he said softly. I came to see a man. Paul's gaze flitted to Ethan and then, a beat too late, to the envelope on the table. He thought it was theater. He did not yet know the actor. Ethan felt, in that moment, the small, terrible ripple that comes when a pond is struck by two stones at once. Paul's laugh had been a shield and a mirror. It had shown Ethan a way out. The laugh could stop the conversation, make it a joke, let him walk away. But Daniel did not accept the joke. Daniel's hand hovered, not on the money, but near it, as if holding the choice in place for Ethan to take or to refuse. Who sent you the note? Paul asked, half teasing, half curious. He had never heard of someone being paid to test a teller. He had never imagined such a thing belonged to them. The radio's slow song thinned into a silence that smelled of beer and fried onions. Ethan's voice came out a little too loud. No one sent it, he said. He did. Paul glanced at Daniel, then back at Ethan. Daniel, he began, then laughed again, the laugh trying to stitch the moment back into ordinary fabric. If you're trying to play spy, you picked the wrong branch. Daniel's eyes were calm, practiced. I picked this branch because it matters. He looked at Ethan as if naming him changed the ledger. You have been here long enough to make choices that mean something. Ethan felt the walls of his life tilt. The man in the suit had not come to be entertained. He had come to open something that had been closed. He had come to ask for a balance and to offer a price that made the question of refusal an act of pride or a kind of suicide. He folded the paper again and placed it back in his pocket, where it sat against his heart like a secret. Outside, rain began again, soft at first and then steady. Inside, the bar hummed back to life. Clinks, a radio chorus, the scrape of a chair. Paul laughed as if everything had been a story, but the man named Daniel did not laugh. He stood, smiled politely, and left with the quiet authority of a man who had put a stone in a pond and watched the ripples begin. Ethan watched him go and felt, with a new sharpness, that his choices had been noticed. The note was not a simple test. It was a door opening, and someone was watching to see whether he would walk through. The morning after the Blue Lantern, the branch felt smaller, as if the building itself had drawn its breath in. Ethan moved through it like a man carrying a secret against his chest. The slip of paper in his pocket had become heavier overnight. Every time he reached for a pen, his fingers brushed it, and the sensation of something waiting made him clumsier than usual. He kept his face calm for the customers. He kept his hands steady when he stamped forms. Inside, his mind rewound the meeting again and again, as if replaying it would reveal a missed line or a hidden cue. Grace watched him with the careful attention of someone who had loved him in small ways for years, not romantically, not loudly, but with a steady loyalty that meant she noticed the tremors he tried to hide. When she brought over the morning deposits, she lingered, the way a friend lingers when something must be said, but no one wants to be the first to speak it. You should have called me, she said at last, not as a reprimand, but as a fact. Her tone had the soft bluntness of someone who had grown up saying what needed saying. If someone offers you money in a bar, it's not for your health. Ethan managed a smile that did not reach his eyes. You would have told me to walk away, he said. I might have, she admitted, and I might have checked in with someone. It's not right to do things alone. You know that. He did know. He also knew the private reasons that made asking for help feel like exposing a wound. He thought of Matthew's voice on the phone, full of plans and untroubled by the ledger he had to hide from his son. He thought of the mortgage letters and the way credit cards had learned his patterns. He thought of the months when a small kindness turned into a necessity and then into a habit that looked dangerously like theft if anyone ever traced the paths. Paul came by the desk with his usual loud step and the manager's air of someone who had been born with confidence like an heirloom. He slapped a hand on Ethan's shoulder and laughed about the Blue Lantern story as if it were a joke already told. But when his eyes lingered a beat too long on Ethan's face, there was a sharpness there that did not belong to someone who only cracked jokes. Paul could be warm. He could be cruel without meaning to. He had targets to meet and a way of making them feel like family faith. That afternoon, he talked numbers and incentives and a plan to pitch a new small business loan program. "We need to push the Henderson file up to corporate by Friday," Paul said casually, as if dropping a useless paperweight. "Mercer wants tighter metrics. He's breathing down the chain." He said the name with a lightness that made Ethan feel something cold run along his spine. Daniel Mercer had no patronage behind it in the branch, a city name, a rumor, someone who existed on press releases and quarterly letters. Paul's mention turned the name into the shape of a foot on their roof. Grace's face tightened at that. "Mercer visited the area last year," she said quietly. "He toured a branch upstate. People said he watched people like he was picking fruit." Ethan sat very still. He remembered Daniel at the bar, his suit, his slow voice, the way he had said, "Balances, tell a story." He remembered how Paul had laughed and how Daniel had not been amused. He had not put the two names together before, and now the pieces slid toward each other like plates on a table. "You know him?" Ethan asked. Grace shrugged. "Not personally, but corporate talks travel. People pass notes. You were right to be careful." That small admission made a new shadow across their morning. If Mercer, if Daniel, was connected to corporate, then the offer at the Blue Lantern carried more teeth than a stranger's paycheck. It meant someone with authority had noticed something in their branch worth testing. It meant they were not just looking for a cheap thrill, they were looking for a fault line. Later, when they locked up for a brief quiet hour, Ethan and Grace sat across from each other in the small back office, the kind of room that smelled of paper and lemon cleaner and faded posters about ethics. Grace unfolded a bank statement and pushed it toward him. "I ran a quick check on accounts you've handled last month," she said. Her hands trembled just enough to show she feared what she might find. "There's a pattern. Tiny transfers timed after you close for the day. Not enough to show as theft on the face of it, but consistent. Someone moved money into a private account, then pulled it out a few days later." Ethan's heart knocked against his ribs like a loose bird. He felt the fleshy part of his hand go cold. "You ran this?" he asked. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I wanted to be sure I wasn't seeing things," she said. "Because I did not want to accuse you. And because if someone is doing this, they might be watching who looks at the books." The world narrowed to the pattern printed on the paper between them. Ethan's first reaction was raw and hot, anger. Someone had been using his attention to hide their moves. Someone had made him look like the problem. Then a softer, more dangerous feeling crept in, relief. If another person had taken money through the accounts, then Ethan might be able to explain away the missing sums. He could point to another name and breathe. But relief was complicated by the fact that the transfers traced back to devices that logged in with Ethan's credentials, times when only he had access to certain systems. He had guarded those credentials the way a man guards his child. The proof on the face of the printout was not kind to him. "You need to tell me everything," Grace said. She looked like a woman who had decided, finally, to stop floating above problems and wade into them. "Names, times, anything. We can try to trace it. But if Mercer is watching, be careful. They have ways to make trouble look like the truth." Ethan told her the honest half of his story. The shift of funds he had made once in a panic, the small promises he had made to himself to fix it later, the late nights when he had invented explanations and kept them like talismans. He did not tell her the other half, the months of quiet borrowing, the way the habit had become a shadow in which he moved without thinking. Grace listened, and when he finished, she pressed her hand on his in a gesture that felt like both comfort and a tether. "We will find a way," she said, "but you will not be alone." Outside, The city moved on with its indifferent rhythm. Customers lined up, a child laughed, a man argued softly with a teller about fees. Inside the branch, a different kind of work began, not the confident signing of loans, but the slow, ugly tracing of footprints. They opened logs, they scrolled through timestamps, and each click was a small confession on a screen. The more they dug, the more the patterns suggested precision, not mistake. Whoever had moved money had done so with a knowledge of bank timing and an understanding of human blind spots. Paul came into the back office twice that day with a grin that grew stiffer each time. He asked how the audit was going, how the new lending push looked. Each time he left, he paused in the doorway and said casually, "If anything funny shows up, call me. We'll handle it internally. No need to make a scene." His eyes, however, darted to the screen and then away, like a man who had seen a snake and hoped no one else had noticed. By evening, the three of them sat around the small table with a dim lamp and a cup of stale coffee between them. The branch had closed. The city outside had the soft hush that comes after rain. Ethan felt the weight of all the choices he had not yet made settling into his bones. He thought of Matthew studying far away, of promises made in a quiet kitchen, of a life built on the simple faith that a man could face his mistakes and pay for them. Then there was the bigger, colder thought. What if Daniel Mercer was not testing loyalty, but gathering evidence? What if his note had been bait not to reveal thieves, but to reveal who would take the bait? If Daniel was the kind of man corporate offices made into kings, then his methods would be precise and his intentions not easily guessed. The offer had been a stone in the pond. The ripples were reaching the shore, and in the middle of the pond stood their choices, small and dangerous. Ethan did not sleep that night. The bank closed, the city quieted, and his small apartment felt too loud with the sound of rain on the roof and the ledger numbers thudding behind his eyes. He had replayed the Blue Lantern meeting a dozen ways and kept returning to one thought. Someone had noticed the fracture in the branch, and they had chosen to prod it. Whoever they were wanted to see how the people inside would move. At 2 in the morning, he went back to the branch. He told himself it was because he could not sit idle. Really, it was because awake hours felt safer than dreams where everything slid away. The lights in the lobby were dim. The cleaning crew had left a wet scent in the air. He sat at his desk with the glow of the computer like a small, honest friend. He opened the audit logs again, scrolling until the timestamps blurred into a river of pale text. He was looking for any pattern he had missed. And then he saw it, a login attempt late at night from a device registered in Grace's name. The IP route matched a cafe 2 blocks from her apartment. The timestamp was one he remembered. The night Ethan had been late with a transfer and had thought he'd covered his trail. The logs showed small transfers into a private account, with withdrawals timed after both their shifts ended. The sequence was neat and deliberate. Whoever operated this had known when Ethan was least likely to notice. Ethan's first pulse was relief. Someone else had touched the metal. His second pulse was a hollow, sinking dread. Grace had been sitting across from him the day before, unraveling the pattern with him. She had been the one who ran the numbers. She had her hand on his like an anchor. Seeing her name in the logs felt like a blade he had mistaken for a spoon. He did not go home. He waited until the bank's back door opened and Grace slipped in, a bundle of keys and a tired look. The light from the office lamp cut her shadow in two. For a moment she did not see him sitting there. Then she glanced up and her face changed in a way Ethan did not recognize. The careful kindness that usually softened her features turned brittle like a leaf under frost. "Late night?" she asked, though her voice contained more than curiosity. Checking the logs, Ethan said. He watched her hands as she set her bag down. Her fingers lingered on the strap, a small tremor betraying fatigue. "You ran the checks yesterday." "I did," she said. "I had to be sure. I wanted to tell you as soon as I was certain." He kept his voice steady. "Why is your login on the list?" For a second, she was a closed thing. Then she slid into the chair opposite and folded her hands. The room smelled of lemon cleaner and the coffee they kept for emergencies. Grace looked at him with eyes that had been steady for so long Ethan had taken them for granted. Now they did not flinch away, but met his gaze like a plea. "I can explain," she said. "It's not what you think." "It looks like you moved money," Ethan said. The sentence came out flat, like a legal fact. "Small amounts, timed after hours, into a private account." Grace's throat worked once. She closed her eyes as if to hold back something. When she opened them, she looked older than the years they had shared in the branch. She exhaled, a sound that might have been a sob if it had been softer. "Ethan," she said, voice small, "I made transfers. I did it to cover something, for someone. I didn't want you to know because I thought I could fix it before anyone saw." He felt cold running through him. "Who? Who did you do it for?" She swallowed. Her fingers found each other and held hard. "My sister, Anna. She fell sick last winter." The hospital bills were. She could not finish the sentence. The ledger inside Ethan's head filled in the blanks. Months of chemotherapy, tests, a rent that had to be paid, medicines that stacked like small ledgers of their own. "I tried to get a loan, I tried everything. And I made a stupid choice. I thought if I moved tiny amounts over time, I could pay it back before anyone noticed. I thought I could hide it in the noise." The story should have been simple, humane. Instead, it landed like a betrayal. Ethan felt his heart fracture into two stories: the woman who had sat by him steady and true, and the woman who had touched the machine that kept his life whole and made it look like theft. He thought of all the times she had paused with him over a problem, her face the map he had trusted. He thought of the hand she had put on him when he confessed half of his sins. He had believed those hands would shield him. Instead, they had moved money. Why? He asked, not because he did not understand, but because he needed to hear her say it. "Why not tell me? We could have found a legal way. We could have." "I was ashamed," she said, a single word that filled the room. "I was ashamed and scared. I was afraid if you knew, you would see me differently. And I was afraid that one more mark on my record would ruin Anna's chances of getting help. I thought I could fix it quietly. I was wrong." Ethan remembered the little things that had seemed ordinary. Grace's quiet phone calls in the evening, an occasional late excuse for leaving the branch, a new winter coat that had been paid for in cash. He had not connected them. He had not wanted to. Now, every kindness reads like a transaction with hidden meaning. "You ran checks," he said slowly. "You pushed me to look at the right accounts. Did you do that on purpose?" Grace's fingers tightened. "I started to panic," she admitted. "When the first small withdrawal went missing, I blamed myself and I tried to patch it. I thought if I flagged the accounts and nudged you to check, it would look like we were catching fraud early. I wanted to stop the transfers before they grew. I did not think it would look like I was staging evidence. I never meant to put this on you." Her voice broke on the last words. She looked younger for a moment, a helpless child caught in a storm of consequences. "I never wanted to hurt you, Ethan. I wanted to save my sister." Ethan's whole body felt numb as if he had submerged in cold water. Rage and pity warred inside him. He could see the moral geometry. Grace's crime was small compared to the need. Her secrecy was human, not malice. But the ledger did not care for nuance. The bank's laws did not tremble at pleas. If discovered, the pattern pointed directly at him. The credentials were his, the timings were his shift, the paper trail would tie him to the accounts. Grace had used his trust as cover. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked again, softer now. "We could have found a way. I would have helped. I thought I could fix it without your help because I was ashamed," she said. "And then Mercer came." Her face changed, hardening. "I was contacted, Ethan. A man calling himself Daniel Mercer. He said he was watching for vulnerabilities. He said he would help my sister if I cooperated. He gave me a choice, reveal myself or he would make sure everything looked like it was you." The world shifted under Ethan like a tide. Daniel Mercer, the name Paul had dropped in passing, the man at the Blue Lantern, the man who had offered money. Grace's confession now folded into a larger, more dangerous geometry. Someone had been manipulating them from the outside, cutting strings only one person could see. "You let him?" Ethan said, incredulous. Grace's shoulders shook. "I didn't think I had a choice. He promised help for Anna. He told me how easily he could make things look bad for me or for you. He said he respected loyalty but hated weak links. He asked me to feed him small confirmations so he would know the branch's weak points. I told him everything I could without making it obvious. I thought I could close the hole and it would stop. I thought I could protect Anna. Ethan looked at her, and for the first time the story had a new villain, a presence that had been moving pieces on the board while the players argued about pennies. The betrayal that cut deepest was not merely Grace's secret transfers, but the choice she had made to bargain with a man whose power could ruin them all. She had betrayed his trust to save someone she loved. She had stepped into an impossible moral trade. "You lied to me," he said softly. "You lied to me and used my name." "I know," she whispered. "I am sorry. I will do anything to fix it." The sentence offered nothing and everything. Ethan could imagine the board, a room of buttoned mouths, the slow machine of corporate consequence. He could imagine Daniel Mercer, patient and precise, watching from a distance like a surgeon deciding where to cut. The betrayal was not clean. It was a messy human tangle of love, fear, and power. Ethan let out a long breath and found he could not be angry enough to burn the entire world down. The ledger on his desk looked suddenly like a map with a new line drawn across it. Grace's confession made his path harder and clearer. The enemy was no longer just an internal mistake. It was a man who could buy silence and orchestrate ruin. Outside, the rain began again, a steady drum. Inside, two people sat with the truth between them. It would change everything. That night, the branch felt like a room with thin walls. Every sound from the street reached them: a siren, a car door, someone laughing too loudly, and then stopping. Ethan could not sleep. He sat at his kitchen table with the ledger open like a wound, and Grace's confession turned in his mind like a key in a lock that did not yet fit. He thought of Anna in a hospital bed, of Matthew studying with the bright stubbornness of youth, of the coin his son had given him that still lived in the drawer. Every small thing he loved suddenly had weight. The next morning, Paul arrived early. He brought coffee for everyone, the kind that tasted like burnt cardboard but came with his easy authority. Ethan watched him move through the office, smiling at customers, nodding to tellers. Paul's cheerfulness was a shield. Ethan had seen it used to blunt bad news, to make problems look manageable. Today it felt forced, like someone wearing a suit 2 sizes too tight. "We got a call," Paul said as he lowered himself into his office chair, the leather sighing under him. "Corporate wants answers." Mercer made some notes after his last visit. They want extra logs and a full account of any anomalies. Ethan felt the floor tilt. His hands tightened on the cup. Mercer called corporate? Paul glanced up, then smiled without humor. Not directly, but someone from his office asked for a routine review. They want it done fast. Grace came in behind him, and her face had the pallor of someone who had been awake for too many nights. "They want everything," she said. "Access logs, transaction histories, staff lists. They'll be here tomorrow morning to start interviews." Ethan could not breathe for a moment. Interviews meant questions. Questions meant names. Names meant the paper trail. He remembered Daniel at the Blue Lantern, his quiet eyes and the money on the table. He remembered the way Daniel had promised help. He remembered Grace's confession about the bargain she had made. The world had narrowed to a single line of light on the ledger, and now someone with more power than them had put a magnifying glass over it. "Who called?" Ethan asked. He tasted the dryness of panic. Was it Daniel? Paul shrugged like a man shrugging off rain. "Hard to tell." Corporate said a concerned party flagged irregularities at regional level. They used Daniel's visit as a reason. "Either way, we have to show we're clean." Grace's hands trembled when she set a stack of printouts on the table. "I can prepare a full audit trail," she said. "We can show the transfers, the withdrawals, everything. If we're honest and quick, maybe corporations will see the pattern as external." Ethan wanted to believe her. He wanted to trust that honesty could save them. But honesty at a bank was also a weapon. If they showed the truth and the truth blamed him, because the credentials bore his name, then honesty would cut him down while saving the branch. If they hid the truth, they would be lying to corporations and building a new danger. Either path carried a sting. The first investigator arrived the next morning, a woman named Claire from Regional Compliance. She wore a Navy suit and an expression like someone who had practiced pity until it was efficient. She asked for logs, for user access reports, for any notes of irregular activity. She asked polite questions that were really sharp instruments. She smiled while she pried. Her presence made the branch smaller, compressed their movements into a tight choreography of answers and half-truths. Ethan answered as best he could. He kept his tone steady and his facts flat. He handed over the reports Grace had compiled. He felt like a man walking a tightrope over fire. Claire praised the thoroughness, then asked one question that made Ethan's throat close. Who has access to Mr. Carter's credentials after hours? He thought of his badge, the way he had used it to slide in for late shifts, the convenience that had become dangerous. He thought of the nights he had left the system logged in, the small habits that now read like invitations. Only me, he said. It felt like a confession. He imagined the paper trail, with his name stamped on it, like an accusation. Claire nodded slowly. We will interview staff separately, she said. You understand that this is routine, but necessary. Being separated felt worse than being together. When the interviews began, each question scraped at the truths they had tried to keep private. Grace sat in a small interview room and told Claire the story of her sister's illness without naming names. She spoke in measured sentences, each one a careful attempt to keep liability at bay. When Ethan's turn came, his answers felt hollow. Every fact he offered seemed to echo in the room with a louder meaning than he intended. You handled transfers on these dates, Claire said, pointing at a list. Why did you make manual overrides at night? Ethan wanted to speak the whole truth. He wanted to say he had moved small amounts to cover a mistake he had made years before, that he had been trying to fix his errors without causing harm. He wanted to say he had been ashamed. He wanted to say he had been weak. But the air in the room smelled of policies and legal definitions, and phrases like good faith had little currency here. I did manual checks, he said. I believed they were necessary for reconciliation. That's all. Claire's pen hovered. We will have to verify all user activities, she said. We will audit home IPs and phone records. These things are standard. The investigator left with a file under her arm and a polite promise that they would follow up. She did not look surprised when Ethan and Grace sat in the empty back room and did not speak for a long time. The lamp hummed above them. Outside, a delivery truck backed up and its brake sighed. The branch felt like a small island with waves of possibility beating against it. That afternoon, Ethan received a text from Matthew. It was a photo of an acceptance letter, a scholarship he had thought was out of reach. The message said, simply, Dad got it. Thank you. Ethan's chest tightened. The ledger that had threatened to break his family began to look like a rope he had to hold for his son. The idea of losing Matthew's future made the small acts of concealment feel less like sin and more like desperate defense. The scales of right and wrong wavered under the weight of love. Then someone pushed the balance the other way. A plain envelope arrived at the branch with no return address. Inside were surveillance stills, a shadowy image of someone using Ethan's badge after hours, another of a hand at the terminal, a third of a figure leaving the building late at night. The pictures were grainy, but the badge was visible. On the back of the photos, in a neat hand, a single sentence, we watch what we test. Ethan sat frozen while the paper slid from his fingers. The message was not a warning, it was an assertion. Someone could make anything look true. Someone could gather images and tell a story that suited them. The photographs eliminated ambiguity. They turned suspicion into evidence in the eyes of anyone who saw them. Paul shut the branch early that day. He paced in his office with his hands clasped like a man trying to hold a storm in his fist. We need to get ahead of this, he said. His voice shook once, and Ethan heard a note in it that had not been there before, fear. If a corporation sees those photos, they'll pull the branch license. People lose homes over these things. Grace's face bleached. She put a hand to her mouth as if the photos were poison. Mercer sent those, she whispered. Ethan thought of Daniel at the Blue Lantern and of the money on the table. He felt the trap close like a fist. Choices narrowed to a single terrible fork: confess and risk immediate ruin, or hide and build a wall of lies to keep the branch and the people he loved safe. Either way, the man named Daniel, the one who watched what he tested, had made their lives a stage and was deciding which scene would play. Outside, the rain began again, hard and driven, making rivers in the gutters. Inside, Ethan sat at his desk with the photos spread out like accusations. He could feel the pulse at his throat. He could feel Grace's hand on his arm. He thought of Matthew laughing over the scholarship photo. He thought of Anna and the pills she needed. He thought of his father's photograph in the drawer, smiling like someone who trusted the world to be fair. He had to choose. The choice pulsed like a bell in his ribs. The sound of it was the beginning of everything that would come next. The hearing room smelled of bleach and paper and a nervous kind of coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed like distant insects. Rain drove at the windows in straight, angry lines, and every drop felt like a small, ticking clock. The branch's little conference room had filled with faces. Claire with her careful papers, two men from regional compliance in bland suits, Paul with his hurry-to-appear calm look, and a silent line of tellers who had come to watch because when the bank's skin trembled, they wanted to see who would bleed. Daniel Mercer came last. He did not step in like a visitor. He moved in like a man who owned the light. For a beat the room swallowed him. Tailored jacket, slow smile, eyes that did not drift but measured. When Paul rose and laughed a thin laugh and greeted him, there was a moment where Paul's smile looked like a child's reaching for approval. Ethan felt sharp and hot, the old ache of being small in another man's secret story. Daniel sat at the head of the table and folded his hands. He spoke in a voice that had been used in boardrooms and briefing notes. "I don't enjoy this," he said, "but I reward honesty and I remove rot. If something in this branch does not meet our standards, we will take action." The men in suits nodded. Claire opened a packet and set photographs on the table, the same grainy frames Ethan had seen before. Someone had cropped them carefully. Someone had dumbed them down so they looked like proof. Daniel did not flinch. He let the pictures sit like stones. Grace's hands were at her knees. Ethan could see the shake in her fingers. Her face had a pale, honest terror to it. There was nowhere to hide in that room anymore. He kept his own palms flat on the table, feeling the printed facts under his skin. He could have run. He could have folded. Instead, he had done one quieter, stranger thing the night before. He had listened. He had sat with Grace, and with the little pieces she had kept, a voicemail she had been too ashamed to delete, a string of messages she had hidden in a drafts folder, a photograph she had refused to show anyone until the right moment. He asked Claire, quietly, "May I show something?" Claire raised an eyebrow, but nodded. The room leaned as if the whole place had expectations. Ethan slid a laptop from his bag and connected it to the small screen. The image of the branch filled the room. Timestamps, logs, call records. Ethan's voice, when he began, was not trembling. It had the flatness of a man who had decided what kind of person he wanted to be in the face of ruin. "Those photos," he said, "were mailed to us with the claim they were from an independent source. They were not." He tapped the keyboard and a folder opened. He played a short voicemail. A recorded voice, smooth and controlled, said, "You have one choice. Help me find the weak points, or I will make sure someone answers for the losses. I can do that quietly, or make an example." The voice was Daniel's. It was the same steady cadence that had been in the bar. It was a voice that made threats feel like administrative notes. The room went cold. Paul's face changed in a way that made Ethan's heart sting, a quick inward folding, like a man who had been looking at the wrong side of a picture. Claire's pen paused. Daniel's smile thinned, the way a blade thins when pressed. Ethan turned the screen and showed metadata. The message had been sent from a corporate number. The photos had been uploaded from an IP link to Daniel's office. The emails had headers traced back to aliases that funneled to the same account. It was a neat, small net. It fits together like a manufactured story. Ethan watched faces shift from suspicion to disbelief to something closer to outrage. Daniel spoke then, calm to the point of cruelty. Those are easy to fabricate. Any competent team can manipulate headers. We run tests like this to root out corruption. Mr. Carter, your credentials show activity in these accounts. You will tell the committee your version. Ethan felt the weight of his choices, like a physical thing in his chest. He could have stood there and denied everything and watched the room accept Daniel's crafted evidence. Instead, he did a different, small bravery. I made transfers, he said, voice low. A long time ago, I made a bad choice to cover a mistake. I tried to fix it without telling anyone. I am not proud. I accept responsibility for that. The confession landed like a bell. It did not clear the room's air, but it changed it. There was respect in truth. There was no mercy, but there was clarity. Ethan could feel Matthew's face in his mind, the soft brightness of a boy who believed in his father. He thought of Anna's cough over the phone. He thought of his father's grin. He did not want to lose them for what he had done. Claire's notebook filled with notes. The investigators murmured about procedure. Daniel's face hardened. He had expected the man at the center to recede. Instead, Ethan had stepped forward and taken some blame. The play shifted. Then Grace did something no script had prepared him for. She stood, hands folded over the small blistering glow of shame. Her voice went thin at first, then steadied. I moved small amounts, she said, because my sister was dying and I was desperate. I thought I could fix it alone so it wouldn't ruin anyone else. I was wrong. And then Daniel found me and he promised help. He threatened me. He said he would make it look like theft and he would make sure someone else paid. I was scared and I let him use me. Her confession was a raw, bright thing. Tears tracked down her cheeks, and she did not try to hide them. She had imagined confession would be the end. Instead, it turned into a spotlight that showed the real villain, a man who could take a private fear and turn it into a weapon. Daniel's voice sharpened. Ms. Foster, he said, using her surname like a scalpel, that is an accusation. Do you have proof that I threatened you? Grace reached into her bag with hands that trembled and handed Claire a phone. She showed messages, short texts, a recorded call, an email where the sender's name hid behind a corporate alias. She had not been able to bear the shame and the blackmail together. She had kept pieces of the puzzle. She had kept them because, she said softly, she had wanted to keep some part of the truth in her pocket, just in case she needed to stop someone worse. Claire took the phone and swiped through the messages. The color drained from her face. She read the headers aloud. The room listened like a body waiting for a verdict. Paul, who had been looking at his shoes, suddenly stood and said, I heard the man on the phone. He called me 2 weeks ago asking about our staffing. I thought he was a corporate concern. His voice broke. He had been wrong. He had trusted the quick kindness of a visiting executive. I did not know he would use it like this. The fabric of the hearing began to unravel. The men from regional compliance spoke into their phones, calling back to corporate IT. Claire asked for a delay while they verified the metadata. The hum of fluorescent lights returned like a backdrop to something new. Possibility. Daniel's face finally lost its polite mask. He stood, and for the first time in the room, he showed anger that was not practiced. You think you can set a trap and win? He said. This is my company's integrity at stake. If you smear me with falsehoods, you used fear to shape people's actions, Ethan interrupted. You sent those photos to make a story. You used Grace because she loved her sister. You tried to make us scapegoats. The room held that moment like a breath. Outside, rain hit the glass with sudden force, and for an instant the world was only the cold sound of water. Corporate IT's line clicked. A voice said they had traced the uploads to an account registered to Daniel Mercer's aid and then redirected through a third-party server. The evidence, which Daniel had assumed he could obscure, began to show the faint stitches of human error. A name, a trace, a timestamp. Daniel's shoulders tightened. The anger that had been a suit he wore in boardrooms frayed. He looked at Grace with something like contempt and pity mixed together. He looked at Ethan and tried, in a small way, to make the room believe the story that saved him. But the slow, certain work of facts had begun. Claire closed her notebook and said in a voice that had grown colder than the fluorescent lights, "We will suspend the branch's account access pending a full investigation. We will remove any individual implicated until we have a clear picture. Mr. Mercer, you will answer corporate IT. Ms. Foster, Mr. Carter, you will provide full statements." It was not the end. It was the beginning. Daniel was escorted out, his control loosened by things he had not expected. A voicemail, a phone, a woman too ashamed to keep her secret forever. Grace wept quietly and laid her head on Ethan's shoulder. Paul sat and put his forehead in his hands, the man who had laughed now small and human. Ethan felt both shattered and apartment. He had confessed his sin, and the consequences would come. He had also been part of exposing something that had used fear as currency. The branch's future was uncertain. Grace's future was uncertain. Daniel's fate would be decided by men in other rooms with files and procedures. Outside, the rain slowed. Inside the small conference room, people stood and collected themselves. Ethan looked at Grace and at Paul and felt that raw, strange thing. Despite the mess, despite the betrayals, the truth had been pulled into light. It was messy and painful and human. When the room emptied, Ethan walked out into the corridor and touched the wall, as if feeling for a pulse. The rain had turned the city into a blurred watercolor again. He held his chest like a man who had been through a storm and could now count what had been lost and what might be saved. He thought of Matthew's scholarship, of Anna's treatment, of a life of small debts, and the long work to pay them back. He thought of honesty and the cost of it. The moral, he realized, was not a line in a ledger. It was a decision made in a small fluorescent room to stop letting fear make choices for them. It would not solve everything. It would not heal all wounds. But the truth, once spoken, changed the map. It had a cost. It also had a way out. The days after the hearing moved like slow tides. Paperwork arrived in thick envelopes, visits came from people whose faces belonged to policies, and the branch hummed with a nervous energy that made ordinary work feel fragile. Claire called once to say the corporate IT team had confirmed the uploads came through an account tied to Daniel's aid. Paul was placed on leave while his decisions were reviewed. Daniel was suspended pending a full inquiry. Grace and Ethan were both put on administrative leave while statements were completed. The branch seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether it would be saved or swept away. At home, the apartment felt both too small and strangely honest. Ethan slept in fits and woke to the same ledger of thoughts. What he had done, what he had hidden, what he had revealed. The confession he had made in the hearing did not erase the wrong he had done. It did, however, make room for something he had not expected. A measure of grace that was not the same as forgiveness, but close. Matthew called often, his voice bravely light. He read passages from his coursework into the phone and sent photos of campus life. Ethan kept those images like warm coins against his chest. They were small proofs that some things still worked. Grace sat with him one evening at the tiny kitchen table. She had the look of someone exhausted of shame and ready to carry the consequences. Her hands were thin, the knuckles a little white from worry. "They asked me a lot of questions," she said. "I told them everything I had. I told them about Anna, about the calls, about Daniel. I gave them dates and messages. She stopped, and a soft sound left her like someone who had run a long way. "You did what you could," Ethan said. He meant it. He had been angry in the first days. Anger had been a clean and burning thing. It made decisions simple. Now it has dulled into something more complex. "You could have come to me." She looked at him with a steadiness he had not seen before. "I know," she said. "I was ashamed. I thought I could be the kind of person who fixed things quietly. I thought I would not need help." She let out a half laugh that was not funny. "I was wrong." Their conversations turned off into Anna. The hearing had not cured her sickness. It had, however, opened doors. When Claire and the corporate team saw the messages and the recordings, someone in the higher hallways had been moved, not only by procedure, but by the human picture they had been shown. An internal fund, a modest safety net the company kept for extraordinary cases, was made available for Anna's care after Grace's cooperation and the publicity of the case. It was not a full cure. It was, though, a way to breathe. Ethan found the news hard to accept. He had been ready to shoulder blame alone, to let himself be the story's villain if that would protect others. But he also knew that hiding pain and making secret bargains had an ugliness that could spread. He had seen it in his own hands when he had shifted a few numbers here and there. He had seen it in Grace when she had tried to save her sister and ended up entangled with a man who used fear as currency. The internal investigation wound on. Paul returned to the branch after review. He was quieter than before, the loudness of confidence tempered by the smell of error. He apologized to the staff in an awkward meeting, his voice bowing like someone who had been learning humility under pressure. He kept his job, but was moved to a different role that required less independent judgment. The branch itself was monitored closely, and changes were made to access protocols. Locks that had been too easy to pick were strengthened. Layers of human oversight were added where machines had once stood alone. Daniel's suspension stretched longer than anyone had hoped. He fought the allegations with the kind of legal force a man with power knows how to wield. His downfall was not sudden. It was the result of patient work, of digital traces and human testimony woven together. Those who had trusted him in the province of authority learned how fragile that trust could be. In the end, corporate took disciplinary steps that shuttered some of his influence and exposed the ways authority could be abused. Ethan's own fate was quieter and more ordinary. Because he had confessed, and because the investigators saw the complexity of the case, the theft small, the motives tangled with family need, the external pressure of a man like Daniel, the bank offered him an alternative to dismissal, a binding repayment plan, mandatory counseling, and a demotion with a probation period. He accepted it. Pride is hard to let go of, but Ethan found in the surrender a kind of relief. He would not walk away unscarred, but he would keep a place at the table and the chance to pay back what he had taken. The moral edges of the story did not smooth themselves. Ethan found himself awake more than once, replaying choices like a ledger where the numbers kept shifting. He understood, finally, how shame could make a person act badly in the name of love. He understood how a promise to a child could make a man trade integrity for safety. He also understood that secrecy rarely protected anyone. It turns out that truth, when offered, exacts a price, but it also allows repair. When Anna's treatment began to show signs of small improvement, Grace cried in the back room of the branch with a group of co-workers who had learned, in those hard weeks, to be human to one another. They organized a small fundraiser, a bake sale for Anna, a roster of shifts to cover Grace when hospital visits piled up. The branch was no longer only a place of ledgers and rules. It had been pulled unwillingly into a web of human care that did not make the consequences vanish, but it made the days have color again. One evening, after most of the papers were signed and some of the meetings had become routine, Ethan walked to the river. The rain had stopped, and the city had the soft aftertaste of clean air. He held the coin Matthew had given him years ago. It felt like a relic of a simpler contract between a father and a son. He thought about balance, not only in numbers but in life. The ledger in his head had columns for duty, shame, love, and truth. He could not pay off all the entries at once, but he could begin to make honest entries day by day. He thought about Daniel and how power can be used to scare people into small betrayals, about Grace and the cost she had paid, and about Matthew and Anna and the small, stubborn reasons people give to survive. He realized the moral was not a neat sentence. It was a practice, choosing honesty when lies seem safer, asking for help when shame screams to stay silent, recognizing that love sometimes looks messy and wrong and still asks for repair. Ethan folded the coin into his palm and let the river's dark flow take his breath away. He felt tired and not yet healed, but also strangely steady. The coming months would be work, making good the accounts, repaying what he could, watching Anna's progress, rebuilding trust where it had frayed. He was not absolved. He knew that, but he had been part of turning a fear into a story that could be told openly, and that mattered. When he walked back home, the light in his apartment window looked like a promise he could keep. Small, deliberate human. He sat at the table and wrote a letter, not to absolve himself, but to say what he had learned. He wrote to Matthew, to Grace's sister who had once been a face on a hospital bed, and to the man he had been, a ledger of mistakes, a hope for repair. The words were simple and hard. They were honest. Outside, the city kept its rhythms. Inside, a few people were trying to live in the space that truth had cleared. It would be slow. It would be costly. But it would be real. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt that was enough. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you'll enjoy. Have a great day.